Have you ever wondered why something as simple as breathing starts to feel like a task? Why even rest feels like a performance? Why doing nothing still leaves you exhausted? We live in a world that glorifies effort, the hustle, the grind, the late nights and early mornings. We've been taught that success comes from force, that anything worth having must be wrestled into existence. That struggle is noble, and yet, deep down there's a whisper, a quiet voice we've long ignored, telling us something's off. Why do we force so much? Why does everything feel heavy? Even love, even faith, even our own breath. The answer isn't out there in the noise. It's tucked inside the silence we've forgotten how to enter. Because what we call effort is often just resistance in disguise. We resist not because we're lazy, but because we're afraid of stillness, afraid that if we stop trying so hard, everything will fall apart, including us. But here's the truth. When you deeply understand something, you stop forcing it. Just watch a skilled dancer. She doesn't muscle her way through the music. She flows because she understands it. Because her body and the rhythm are not two things anymore. The same is true for life. Understanding creates ease. Misunderstanding creates struggle. But we've mistaken struggle for meaning. We think, if it's hard, it must be real. If I'm tired, I must be doing it right. If it hurts, it must be love. No, that's not truth. That's conditioning. Look at nature. The river doesn't push, it flows. The tree doesn't force its leaves to grow, it simply grows. The sun doesn't scream to rise, it just does. Everything that truly understands its nature moves with ease, but us. We force our smiles, we force our beliefs, we even force our spirituality. We chant words we don't understand. We sit in meditation, chasing silence like a goal to achieve. We force ourselves to let go. Ironically, by trying harder. How strange, how human. Maybe it's time to pause, to gently ask, what if the struggle isn't a sign of virtue, but of confusion? Because when the mind sees clearly, it doesn't cling, it doesn't demand, it doesn't rush, it trusts. Not in some blind, idealistic way, but in the quiet, powerful way of someone who knows how things truly are. Understanding isn't loud. It doesn't beg to be noticed. It doesn't perform. It doesn't say, look at how enlightened I am. It simply is, like the still lake, like the breath before words, like a monk who smiles and says nothing, because what needs to be said was already understood long ago. You might ask, but if I don't try, won't I become passive? No, this isn't about doing less. It's about doing without tension, without the tightness of ego, without the inner war of always proving, always pushing. Imagine walking across a narrow bridge. If you stiffen up, panic, and overthink each step, you wobble. But if you relax and trust the flow of your body, you walk across with ease. This is not magic, this is clarity. Ease is not laziness. Ease is a byproduct of insight, of seeing the nature of life as it is. Ever-changing, interconnected, never fully under our control. The Buddha called it dukkha, the subtle dissatisfaction born from clinging to how we want things to be, instead of how they are. The more we resist impermanence, the heavier life becomes. But when we truly understand impermanence, when we let go of the fantasy that things should last forever, ease returns, not because life changed, but because we did. So the real question isn't, how can I make life easier? But rather, what am I misunderstanding that makes it feel so hard? Maybe it's the idea that I have to carry everything alone. Maybe it's the belief that I need to fix everything. Maybe it's the silent shame that tells me I'm not allowed to rest. Maybe it's time to unlearn the noise and rediscover the wisdom of stillness. Because when you see clearly, when understanding lands like a feather instead of a hammer, everything begins to soften. Your breath, your shoulders, your gaze, your thoughts, and for the first time in a long while, you realize you don't need to fight your way to peace. You just need to stop fighting, and that, perhaps, is where the real journey begins. There's a hidden intelligence in nature. You see it when leaves fall without resistance, when waves retreat with grace, when birds migrate without consulting a map. No one forces the moon to wax and wane. No one argues with the wind. No tree resents the winter or clings to its blossoms. Nature flows because it understands, and yet, we, the most intelligent of all creatures, resist that flow at every turn. We resist change. We resist loss. We resist aging, failure, uncertainty, even love. We try to build a dam against impermanence, not knowing that this very act is what makes life feel so damn heavy. Imagine a fish that forgets it's in water. It starts trying to swim harder, to control every current, to push its way forward with tension and panic. But the ocean doesn't need to be conquered. It only needs to be understood. The Buddha once taught that dukkha, suffering, stress, friction, comes not from the world itself, but from our refusal to move with it. We want permanence in a world of change. We want certainty in a world of flux. We want control in a world built on interdependence. And so we resist, we force, we struggle. But when we stop resisting, when we start to see life not as a battlefield, but as a river, we begin to flow again. Flow is not passivity, it's alignment. A sailor does not fight the wind. She learns its nature, adjusts the sail, and lets the wind carry her. That's not weakness, that's wisdom. In Zen, there's a saying, the bamboo bends with the wind. It does not break, not because it is weak, but because it knows how to yield. Can we live like that? Think of a time when you truly understood someone, not just their words, but their fears, their heart, their pain. Didn't your frustration dissolve? Didn't ease naturally arise even if nothing had changed? That's the power of insight. Understanding doesn't just change the situation, it changes you. And once you change, your whole relationship with the world shifts. You stop forcing your opinions. You stop needing everyone to agree. You stop reacting and start responding, not out of fear, but out of clarity. In Buddhist teachings, there's the concept of dependent origination, that everything arises due to conditions. Nothing exists independently. Nothing happens without causes. The wind blows because of pressure systems. The tree sways because of the wind. Your thoughts arise because of memory, emotion, sense input, karma. When you truly understand this, how everything is interwoven, how nothing stands alone, you stop asking, why is this happening to me? And you start asking, what causes are giving rise to this? That single shift, from judgment to curiosity, from blame to observation, is liberation. Suddenly, life becomes a dance, not a duel. Instead of gripping the steering wheel, you begin to glide with the current. You become less like a warrior and more like water, formless, gentle, yet unshakably powerful. Because here's the paradox. When you flow with nature, you don't lose control, you gain harmony. But flow requires trust, and trust comes from seeing deeply, from knowing that life, even in its uncertainty, has rhythm. A tide comes in and it goes out. A breath rises and it falls. Joy comes and sorrow follows. Everything moves in rhythm. When we understand this, we stop panicking when things fall apart. We stop clinging when they come together, because we know this too is part of the flow. That's why the great masters always seemed so calm, not because they had fewer problems, but because they saw the nature of things. They didn't fight with time. They didn't argue with reality. They walked with it hand in hand. Their ease wasn't laziness. It was the stillness of knowing, this is how things are, and that's okay. So the question isn't, How do I escape the chaos? The question is, can I understand the current well enough to move with it instead of against it? And when you do, life no longer feels like something to survive. It becomes something to surf, to dance with, to honor, because in the end, the river doesn't care if you fight it. It keeps flowing. But when you understand the river, you begin to float, and in that floating, you rediscover the peace that was never really lost, only misunderstood. We hear it all the time, let it go, just let go. As long as you let go, you'll be free. But what does that really mean? Most of us confuse letting go with giving up. One feels like freedom, the other like defeat. So how do we know the difference? Let's start here. Giving up comes from exhaustion. Letting go comes from clarity. One is driven by fear, the other by wisdom. You give up because something feels too hard, because you think this will never change, because you feel small, incapable, broken. But letting go, that comes when you've seen deeply enough to realize you never had control to begin with. Letting go isn't saying, I'm done. It's saying, I understand. Imagine someone clinging to a rope. That's burning their hands. They grip harder, thinking they can save it, fix it, make it work. But the longer they hold on, the more they suffer. Letting go in that moment isn't weakness, it's wisdom. It's not walking away from responsibility. It's walking away from delusion. In Buddhism, this is central. The root of suffering isn't pain, it's clinging. We cling to what we love. We cling to what we fear. We cling to who we think we are. We even cling to suffering because it's familiar. Letting go doesn't mean you stop caring. It means you stop controlling. It means you stop trying to mold life into your personal fantasy. It means you stop arguing with what is. Here's a story. A student came to a Zen master, deeply frustrated. He said, "Master, I've been meditating for years, but I still feel stuck. I still feel anxious. I still feel like I'm not enough." The master simply smiled, walked over and poured tea into the student's cup, and kept pouring. Tea spilled over the rim, down the table, onto the floor. "Stop," the student cried, "it's overflowing." The master looked him in the eyes. "Exactly, your mind is like this cup, so full of effort, judgment, comparison. There is no room for peace. Let go of trying. Only then can clarity enter." We often think striving is the answer, that if we just try harder, things will get better. But sometimes it's not about trying harder. It's about trying differently, or sometimes not trying at all. Just being, just seeing clearly. Letting go doesn't mean you stop acting. It means you act without tension. You do what needs to be done. But you're not attached to how it turns out. You plant seeds, but you don't scream at the tree to grow. Think of a lotus. It blooms not because it forces itself open, but because the conditions are right. It lets go of the mud, the darkness, the water. Not with rejection, but with trust. You too don't have to push your way into peace. You can allow it to rise. Letting go is like exhaling. It's natural. If you stop holding your breath, but beware, the ego is tricky. Sometimes it dresses up giving up as letting go. It whispers, "You're being spiritual now. You're detached." But underneath, it's just fear in disguise. How do you know the difference? Here's the test. When you give up, you feel contracted, heavy, bitter, numb. When you let go, you feel spacious, open, light, free. One is defeat, the other is liberation. The Buddha did not give up the world. He let go of illusion. He didn't reject life. He embraced it with open eyes, no longer needing it to be anything other than what it was. And from that place, his love became unconditional, his peace unshakable. Letting go is not the end, it's the beginning. It's the space where healing happens, where insight enters, where grace unfolds. It's where you stop fighting the current and start floating with the river of what is. You no longer say, This shouldn't be happening. You say, this is happening. Now how shall I meet it? With clarity, with courage, with calm. So ask yourself gently, what am I holding on to? That's already asking to be released. A grudge, a belief, a version of yourself that no longer fits. Let it go, not with shame, but with reverence, because letting go isn't a loss, it's a return to who you truly are. Beneath all the stories, to the silence that was always there, waiting. What makes life feel so heavy? Is it the job, the bills, the failures, the people who left? Or is it something deeper, something less visible, but always present? We carry a weight most of us can't name, but we feel it. In our tight chests, in our restless minds, in that constant whisper, I should be more, I should be better. That weight is the self, or more precisely, what we think is the self. The ego isn't who you are, it's who you believe you are. It's the story you've told yourself for so long. You forgot it was a story. I'm smart. I'm not good enough. I'm the successful one. I'm the failure. I deserve more. I don't belong. These aren't facts. They're identities, sticky labels we've attached to our being. And once we attach, we defend, we protect the label, we feed it, we suffer for it. In Buddhism, this false sense of I is called atta, the illusion of a solid, unchanging self. But when you look closely, where is the I? Are you your body? It changes, ages, dies. Are you your thoughts? They flicker and contradict. Are you your feelings? They rise and fall like tides. So what exactly are you clinging to? Ego says, I must be someone. I must be seen. I must be respected. And so we begin the performance. We curate our image, we compete, we compare, we try to control how we appear, to others and to ourselves. But here's the truth. The more you become someone, the heavier you feel, because now every action is a calculation, every interaction a negotiation. You're not living anymore, you're managing a brand. And what happens when the image cracks, when you fail? When you're rejected, when you're not enough by the world's standards, you suffer not because of what happened, but because your ego took a hit. You don't say, I lost my job. You say, I am a failure. That's the trap. The Buddha saw through this. He didn't say, be a better self. He said, see that the self is not solid, not as a belief, as a realization. Because once you realize there is no fixed self, no permanent me to protect, defend, or prove, a strange thing happens. The weight drops, life becomes lighter, because there's no one left to carry. Here's a story. A monk once carried a heavy bundle on his back, traveling for days through the mountains. He refused to let anyone help. He believed it was his burden, his path, his responsibility. Finally, exhausted, he collapsed by a stream and whispered, I can't do this anymore. An old hermit appeared, smiled, and said, you are not tired from the path. You are tired from who you think you must be while walking it. The monk wept, and slowly, he began to put the bundle down. That's what ego does, it whispers. You have to do more, be more, prove more. And you believe it, until one day you don't. And in that moment, you don't lose anything real. You just lose the prison. So how do we loosen ego's grip? Not by fighting it, not by killing it, but by seeing it, by noticing how it creeps into your kindness. I'm so generous, aren't I? How it hijacks your silence. Look how spiritual I'm becoming. How it even turns humility into a mask. The ego is clever, but it can't survive honest awareness. When you see it clearly, gently, without judgment, it begins to dissolve, and what remains? Not emptiness, not passivity, but freedom. Now you can speak without trying to impress, work without needing validation, love without possession, fail without collapse. Now your presence feels light, not because you don't care, but because you don't carry the illusion of being someone special anymore. You're just here, fully, naturally, without the heavy costume of identity. The lotus blooms not by proving it's a flower, it just opens. Likewise, your true nature doesn't need to be constructed, it only needs to be uncovered. And when it is, you don't disappear, you return to stillness, to spaciousness, to that weightless place where nothing needs to be added. Because you were never missing anything, only believing you were. In a world obsessed with doing, we worship the busy. We say things like, "I barely slept last night," as if that's a badge of honor. We fill our calendars until there's no white space left, no breath, no room for life. Somewhere along the way, we confused motion with progress. But here's the truth, whispered by the wise. Doing more doesn't always mean achieving more. Sometimes doing less allows what really matters to emerge. In Zen, there's a phrase, Wu Wei, effortless action. It doesn't mean being lazy. It means acting without resistance, without ego, without inner noise. It means becoming like the archer, who lets the arrow fly not with brute strength, but with alignment, precision, and calm. In that stillness, there's power. Think of water. It doesn't push its way forward. It doesn't scream, it simply finds the way. Soft, yielding, unhurried. Yet over time, it carves through stone. Now think of fire. It burns everything it touches. It rages, it consumes, it demands. Most of us live like fire. We think intensity equals importance. That if we do more, harder, faster, we'll get somewhere. But sometimes all we're doing is burning ourselves out. The Buddha did not rush. He walked slowly, spoke little, sat under a tree for 49 days. Not to do, but to see. And from that deep seeing came compassionate, effective action. Clear, unclouded, true. He didn't multitask. He didn't hustle. He just responded with full presence. And when he acted, his action moved mountains. Doing less doesn't mean doing nothing. It means doing one thing, fully, consciously, without being torn in 5 directions. It's the difference between a distracted chef who burns the soup while checking messages and a monk who sweeps the floor as if it were the temple itself. One is movement, the other is mindfulness. Here's a story. A young disciple once asked his Zen teacher, "Master, what is enlightenment?" The teacher replied, "Chop wood, carry water." The student frowned. "That's it." "Yes," the master smiled. "But after enlightenment, you will still chop wood and carry water, just without the weight of self. Same action, different mind, that's the shift. You see, it's not about what you do. It's about how you do it. When ego is involved, even helping others becomes a performance. When presence is involved, even washing a cup becomes sacred. Doing less means stripping away the drama, the commentary, the pressure to prove. It means being here fully, for what life is asking of you now. Not later, not better, not more, just this as it is. We don't need to force our way into effectiveness. We need to remove what blocks our natural clarity. Think of a mirror. It doesn't have to do anything to reflect. It simply needs to be clean. Your mind, when still, knows what needs to be done. No panic, no perfectionism, just clarity, and from clarity, right action flows, effortless, precise, kind. So ask yourself, am I doing this because it truly matters, or because I'm afraid of being still? Am I working to express my heart, or to fill the silence? Am I taking action because I'm clear, or because I'm anxious? There is a difference, and the body feels it. One leaves you tight, the other leaves you light. In the end, when you let go of the need to prove, you begin to move with grace. When you stop doing for approval, you act with quiet joy. And when you stop trying to do everything, you begin to do what really matters. Less noise, more meaning, less effort, more flow, because sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply to be still. And from that stillness, the action that arises is no longer yours, it belongs to life. Have you ever met someone who didn't need to say much, yet their presence felt like a mountain? They didn't impress with words. They didn't decorate their sentences with cleverness, but when they spoke, every word carried weight. Every silence carried peace. That is the echo of deep wisdom. In today's world, complexity is glorified. We think more words mean more intelligence. More decorations mean more beauty. More features mean more value. But in the eyes of the wise, the simpler something is, the closer it is to truth. The Buddha once said, "A fool speaks much, a wise one remains silent." Not because they don't know, but because they know too well how easily words can deceive. They've seen that the deepest truths can't be captured in language, only lived, only embodied, and so they live in a way that speaks louder than speech. The wisest people don't make you feel small, they make you feel still. They don't demand attention, they create space. Their gestures are quiet, their choices are intentional. Their rooms are uncluttered, not because they follow a trend, but because their inner world is already in order. They don't need more, because they've already tasted what's real. Here's a story. A philosopher once came to visit a Zen master. He spoke endlessly about scriptures, theories, and his own insights. The master listened silently, then poured him tea. The cup filled to the brim, and the master kept pouring. The tea spilled onto the floor. "Stop, the cup is full," the philosopher cried. The master smiled, "Just like your mind. Wisdom doesn't seek to impress, it seeks to liberate. And that liberation often comes, not from adding, but from letting go. Letting go of opinions, of being right, of being seen as spiritual. The truly wise don't perform wisdom, they simply live it. Quietly, humbly, consistently. They don't wear robes of superiority, they wear humility. They walk slowly, speak gently, and when they teach, they speak in stories, not sermons. They point you inward, not toward themselves. They don't ask you to believe. They invite you to see for yourself. In Zen, there's a saying, "Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water." It means this: wisdom doesn't make you float above life. It brings you deeper into it, but you do things now, with a clear mind, a calm heart, no more trying to prove anything. The action is the same, but the weight is gone. Simplicity is not a style, it's the natural fragrance of clarity. When your mind is no longer clouded by endless desires, fears, identities, what remains is what matters most, and it's often very simple. Here's a truth we forget: the sun doesn't shout, yet it lights up the whole world. The tree doesn't move, yet it gives shade, fruit, and peace. The ocean doesn't speak, but it reflects the entire sky. Simplicity isn't the absence of power, it's the presence of essence. So how do you recognize a wise person? Not by their titles, not by the number of followers, not even by how spiritual they appear, but by how you feel around them. If you feel calm, if you feel seen without judgment, if you feel safe to be real, you're likely in the presence of wisdom. Because the wise don't fill the space, they make room for you to be whole in a world chasing more. The wise return to less. They don't carry 10 bags. When one will do, they don't say 1,000 things. When one truth is enough, and they don't need to be right, because they've realized truth isn't about winning, it's about freeing. So if you're on the path and you find yourself simplifying, needing less, quieting more, letting go of being seen, you're not losing your edge. You're gaining your essence. You're not becoming boring, you're becoming real. And maybe, just maybe, you're touching wisdom. In the chaos of the world, we search endlessly for peace. We chase it in relationships, in new jobs, in retreats, in books, even in spirituality itself. But have you noticed? The more desperately we search for peace, the more it seems to escape us. Why? Because peace isn't something we can possess. It's something we must uncover. And the path to it begins with a quiet, honest clarity. Imagine a muddy pond. No matter how hard you try to scoop the mud out, the water stays murky, but leave it alone truly still. And the mud settles, the water clears. That's how the mind works. Peace is not created. It's revealed. When the mud of confusion, desire, and fear sinks, clarity is not about having all the answers. It's about seeing clearly what is, right now as it is. No filters, no projections, no clinging. It's looking at a painful feeling and not needing to label it bad. It's witnessing a desire and not chasing it blindly. It's hearing your own thoughts and realizing you are not them. In Buddhism, this is called vipassana, insight. Insight cuts through illusion, and when illusion falls, peace arises, because what disturbs us is not what happens. It's our confusion about what happens. We're not tormented by reality. We're tormented by the stories we attach to it. A Zen student once asked, "What is enlightenment?" The master replied, "When the clouds disappear, the moon is seen." The moon was always there. It didn't arrive with effort. It was revealed by clarity. Likewise, peace has always been inside you. It doesn't come from controlling life. It comes from seeing through it. Let's pause, close your eyes, breathe. Feel this moment. Don't fix anything. Don't improve anything. Just let it be clear. That stillness you feel, that's not from the outside. That's your nature. Uncluttered by thought. Many people mistake peace for silence, or for escape, or for controlling everything perfectly. But peace is not silence, it is inner spaciousness. You can sit in the middle of a storm and still feel it. You can walk through a noisy city and carry it in your breath, because clarity doesn't depend on conditions. It arises from understanding conditions deeply. Here's the paradox. The clearer your vision, the less control you need. The more you see things as they are, the less you need them to change. And when you stop fighting life, you start flowing with it. That's when peace enters, not like a guest, but like a long-lost homecoming. People often ask, "But how do I get clarity?" The answer is both simple and radical. Stop running, stop grasping, start observing, sit, breathe, watch. And most importantly, question not the world but your own mind. Is this thought true? Is this feeling permanent? Is this me, or just a cloud passing through? Through deep seeing, the turbulence fades, and what remains is the stillness within. A story. A monk was sweeping the ground in the monastery courtyard. Another monk walked by and asked, "Why are you sweeping so carefully?" The first monk replied, "I'm sweeping away my delusions." The second monk smiled and said, "But isn't that also a delusion?" The first monk paused and quietly nodded. You see, even the effort to clean ourselves can become another layer of confusion. If it's driven by restlessness, true clarity doesn't push, it allows. It's not a tense search, it's a gentle uncovering, and in that clarity, peace arises naturally, not as a goal, but as a byproduct of truth. The Buddha did not offer a peace that comes and goes. He pointed to nibbana, the extinguishing of the flame of craving, aversion, and delusion, not a mystical escape, but a deep and stable clarity that no storm can shake. And when the fire of confusion is gone, what remains is coolness, stillness, ease. So here's the insight to carry. You don't need to chase peace. You only need to see clearly what's blocking it, and when you do, you'll realize it was never lost, only hidden. Don't try to force peace. Invite it with clarity. Watch your thoughts, like clouds drifting by. Return to the breath, return to the body, return to now, and find the stillness that was always yours. Why do we feel the need to prove ourselves? To show the world we are worthy, to prove we're strong, intelligent, successful, enlightened, even spiritual, from school grades to job titles, from social media, likes to the perfect meditation pose. So much of life becomes performance. But here's the paradox: the more you need to prove, the less peace you have. Let's look deeper. When you feel the urge to prove yourself, what is really happening somewhere inside? You're not fully convinced you're enough. You don't seek applause unless part of you doubts your value. "Look at me" is often another way of saying, "Please confirm I matter." In Buddhism, this is called mana, conceit, but it's not just about arrogance. It's also about comparison, the need to be better, or at least not worse than others. It hides beneath the surface, in subtle spiritual pride, in the chase for titles, even in the desire to appear humble. It's all just ego playing dress-up. A Zen story tells of a monk who claimed he had attained enlightenment. He walked proudly, quoting scriptures, showing off his stillness. An old master watched him for a while, and then asked, "If you're so empty, why are you so full of yourself?" The room went silent. You see, truth doesn't need decoration, and depth doesn't need display. There is a quiet kind of power in those who have nothing to prove. They don't shout, they don't boast, they don't seek validation, because real understanding brings a profound ease. And with that ease comes freedom from performance. They're not in a competition, they're in communion with life, with others, with the present moment. Think of the sky. It doesn't try to impress you. It just is, endless, spacious, unafraid of being misunderstood. True wisdom is like that. It doesn't argue, it doesn't try to win. It doesn't need to shine because it already glows from within. Why does this matter? Because needing to prove is a form of spiritual tension. It's like wearing armor everywhere, even in places where no one's attacking you. You walk heavier, speak louder, exhaust yourself, trying to uphold a version of yourself you think the world will love, but the cost, your own peace. And what if you simply dropped the armor? What if you didn't have to prove anything? Not even your enlightenment. You'd breathe deeper, smile easier, speak less, and listen more, because there's no stage, no spotlight. Only the joy of being pure and unfiltered. The Buddha didn't seek fame. He didn't try to prove his wisdom. In fact, after enlightenment, he hesitated to teach, not because he was unsure, but because he knew. Truth doesn't need to be sold. It only needs to be seen. And those ready for it will see. You know who's most convincing? The one who has stopped convincing. You trust them not because of their words, but because of their presence. It's not what they say. It's how they are, calm, rooted, empty of ego, full of clarity. Here's a truth you can carry with you. The more you understand yourself, the less you need others to understand you. The more peace you find within, the less approval you chase without. And in that space, you begin to live rather than perform. A gentle reflection. Think of the moments when you felt most at ease. Was it when you were being applauded? Or when you were simply yourself, unconcerned with how others saw you? Real peace doesn't come from impressing the world. It comes from no longer needing to. So next time you feel the need to prove, pause, breathe. Ask yourself, what if I did? Let the need fall away. Stand where you are. Let your being speak louder than your words, because the most beautiful presence is the one that doesn't announce itself. It just quietly is. Imagine waking up one day and life no longer feels like a weight to carry. You're not in a rush. You're not behind. You're not trying to fix, prove, or escape anything. You're simply present, alive, clear, and quietly joyful. This isn't fantasy. This is what happens when we live with insight, not knowledge, not belief, but insight, a direct seeing into the truth of things. In Buddhism, insight is called vipassana. It means seeing reality as it is, not through our filters, habits, or fears. And when we see things clearly, we stop struggling with what is. We no longer fight impermanence. We no longer grasp for control. We no longer chase the illusion of a fixed self. And the result, life becomes light. This lightness isn't superficial. It doesn't mean we float above responsibilities. It means we carry life without dragging it. Just like a leaf floats on water, not because it avoids the current, but because it surrenders to it. Insight teaches us that life is not a problem to be solved, but a process to be lived moment by moment. When you live with insight, you listen more, argue less. You pause before reacting. You notice the small, sacred details of the everyday. You forgive faster, not because others are right, but because you no longer need to be right. You see through the story of ego. You watch your thoughts like clouds, your emotions like waves. None of them define you, and slowly, without force, you return to center, to silence, to stillness, to the natural ease of being. Let me tell you a Zen parable. A monk asked the master, "Master, how do I enter the way?" The master replied, "Do you hear the stream outside?" "Yes," the monk said, "enter from there." You see, the way isn't somewhere far. It begins in this moment, in this breath, in this awareness of sound, thought, feeling. No need to go anywhere, just open your eyes inward. That's insight. What happens when insight touches your relationships? You stop demanding others to fulfill your emptiness. You stop projecting your pain onto their behavior. You start seeing people, not as objects to fix or use, but as beings just like you, trying to navigate the same ocean of suffering and joy. Compassion blossoms, not as a strategy, but as a natural outflow of clarity, and suddenly, life becomes lighter not just for you, but for everyone you meet. Living with insight also changes your approach to time. You don't rush into the future or dwell in the past. You see that the only place life is alive is here, so you begin to slow down, to savor, to stop multitasking presence. You drink tea with full attention. You breathe like it's sacred. You speak only when words add truth or kindness, no longer caught in what's next. You find depth in what is. And what about work? With insight, work is no longer about proving worth. It becomes a vehicle for mindfulness, an expression of care. Even the most ordinary task, sweeping the floor, answering an email, becomes a chance to practice presence. The Buddha once said, "When walking, just walk. When sitting, just sit. Above all, don't wobble." In other words, don't split your being. Wherever you are, be all there. That is the lightness of full presence. But insight isn't always a thunderbolt. Often it arrives quietly, like the moment you realize you don't need to win an argument, or the gentle awareness that your anger is just hurt in disguise. Insight is subtle but powerful, and once it opens your eyes, you can never fully go back to sleep. You start to see the hidden causes of suffering. You start to recognize the moments when ego speaks. You start to choose differently, not out of guilt but out of wisdom, and slowly, life becomes light. So how do you cultivate this way of living? Not by force, not by chasing, but by looking, by sitting with yourself in silence, by asking what is really true here, by watching your thoughts without clinging, by letting go gently. Insight grows in stillness. It flowers in humility. It matures through experience, not just theory. And once it roots in you, even sorrow becomes softer. Even pain gains meaning. Even endings feel sacred. A final reflection. The path of awakening is not about escaping life. It's about engaging it with such clarity that you no longer suffer from your illusions. You see the waves, but you're not afraid because you've seen the ocean. And when you live like that, with light in your eyes and no burden on your back, others feel it too. They don't just hear your words, they feel your presence. They breathe easier around you because your peace becomes contagious. This is the lightness of insight. It's not something you earn. It's something you remember, and it was always yours. At the end of all seeking, when the questions dissolve and the striving fades, we find something unexpected, not a grand revelation, not a triumphant moment of conquest, but something gentle, like the hush that falls over a forest after rain, like a mother's gaze needing no words, like breath steady, quiet, present. True understanding is gentle. It doesn't shout. It doesn't need to win. It doesn't try to be seen. It simply is. We began this journey with a question: why does ease arise when understanding is deep? And now we return full circle, because understanding isn't about answers. It's about seeing clearly. And in that clarity, no longer resisting, no longer pushing against the current of life, no longer clinging to the weight of ego, no longer afraid of change, of loss, of being still. The Zen masters often say, when the mind is clear, the path is simple. The great way is not difficult if you do not pick and choose. These aren't just clever sayings. They are reminders that the deepest truths are never complicated. They are not tangled in philosophy. They are lived, embodied, and deeply kind. Have you noticed? The truly wise speak softly. They do not boast. They do not compete. They do not need to correct others, because they are no longer correcting themselves. Their understanding has dissolved the inner war, and from that stillness, everything becomes gentle. When we truly understand, we no longer need to chase perfection. We allow people to be as they are. We meet the world with less judgment and more wonder. We forgive ourselves not because we've become ideal, but because we've stopped believing we must be. That is real ease, not laziness, not withdrawal, but a graceful flow with life as it is. In the silence of insight, we begin to see we don't have to hold so tightly. We don't have to explain so much. We don't have to defend who we are. We simply are. And that is enough. That's why ease is the final sign, not of giving up, but of having seen through. When the fire of striving burns out, the warmth of being remains, and it is soft. So where do we go from here? Nowhere. We return back to breath, back to presence, back to the moment unfolding right here now. We do not need to arrive. We only need to remember. Remember the simplicity we once knew as children, the clarity we had before becoming someone, the peace that arises when we stop grasping. That's the return to ease. In the end, the highest wisdom doesn't shout from a mountaintop. It whispers in stillness. It reminds you of something you always knew, but had forgotten, that you are already whole, already free, already home, and home is gentle. If something in this message resonated with the quiet truth within you, if it helped you remember even a little of who you are beneath the noise, then you are already on the path. Here at Zen Buddhism Wisdom, we don't offer quick fixes. We walk slowly through deep truths. We explore silence, presence, and the soft power of letting go. If you'd like to walk this path with us, gently, honestly, and with open heart, we invite you to subscribe, not out of urgency, but out of resonance. Subscribe to Zen Buddhism Wisdom, and may each video be a doorway back to yourself.